Kyle here from allmediareviews.blogspot.com. Here to do some reviews today. The first review I actually meant to talk about yesterday, but as quickly as possible. It was on Showtime. I guess it might have screened at maybe South by Southwest or even Sundance. The Sheryl Crow documentary that was on Showtime. It premiered last Friday, May 6th. Just titled Sheryl. Trying to go into this as briefly as possible, but and also as sort of tactfully as possible, I suppose. So of course I love, my favorite musician of all time is Kevin Gilbert. Kevin Gilbert dated Sheryl Crow, met Sheryl Crow, dated Sheryl Crow. Sheryl Crow joined Toy Matinee, and then she was working on her solo album and met and hung out with Kevin and the group that was known as the Tuesday Music Club. I've seen it that way, not necessarily the Tuesday Night Music Club. It was just referred to as the Tuesday Music Club. And then her debut album came out as the Tuesday Night Music Club. Initially, some of the songwriting credits weren't allotted exactly as they should have been, and then eventually corrected, and that's been somewhat documented. If you don't know the story, you can look it up. And of course, it's kind of, it's controversial in some ways. The Kevin Gilbert fan base, many of them feel strongly about, Kevin Gilbert's death and what happened with him and Sheryl after things kind of went south, and her Grammy and stuff like that. But there's also a lot of Sheryl Crow, or a lot of Kevin Gilbert fans that like Sheryl Crow. Of course, Bill Bottrell worked with both of them, and some of the other members worked with her. So getting into the documentary itself, and the thing about this is that there was a behind the music. My wife's a Sheryl Crow fan. She's a Sheryl Crow fan going back to the 90s. I mean, I knew Sheryl Crow too. I knew All I Want to Do mostly, and a couple of the other songs on the Tuesday Night Music Club album. But she got into her. Sheryl Crow, Katie Lang, Chris Isaak, and I don't know if it was Liz Phair also in that group. She discovered all these people right when a lot of her friends were, pushing some of their stuff on her, and right after she discovered her Monkees and Michael Nesmith phase was not at its peak. Maybe it wasn't necessarily down, but anyway, it was sort of a good alternative for her, and Sheryl Crow was one of those artists, and she got into her. She really enjoyed Sheryl Crow, long before I ever met her, crossed paths or whatever. And so when I met her, it was ironic that she was a Sheryl Crow fan. She didn't know who Kevin Gilbert was, of course. But so Sheryl Crow herself, though, because of everything that sort of has happened, a lot of it, like her response, her interviews, the content that's been put out there about her from the media, for the better part of 20 some odd years. Not just with Kevin, with some of the other kind of, I wouldn't call it tabloids, but just her relationships with different, high profile men, frankly. Owen Wilson, she was involved with Eric Clapton to an extent, maybe. And then, of course, Lance Armstrong. Oh, sorry about that. I won't call. Anyway, so she just had been very sort of, the amount of interviews and questions to her about some of the stuff, including Kevin Gilbert, were rarely, if ever, discussed. Where there was not a lot of talk about that. I know recently Sheryl Crow had shied away or dismissed releasing albums, and she was going to release singles, songs. So the other thing that was weird is I know she had a period of time, because she had these relationships with Stevie Nicks, Fleetwood Mac, and the Eagles, and of course in the documentary Joe Walsh is interviewed. He doesn't look good. I know there was something about him my wife and I watched in the last year that he was talked about. We never saw the Eagles documentary on Netflix, but how he abused drugs, be an understatement, in the 70s. It's it was sort of hard to believe he was still around, kind of like Keith Richards. But so yeah, she has a relationship with Joe Walsh, with the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac both. among other. Then Clapton too. It's weird. She played with Clapton. There's footage in the documentary of her playing with Prince too, of her song "Every Day Is a Winding Road." Anyway, but first and foremost, the most kind of important or significant thing for me as a Kevin Gilbert fan is was she going to talk about everything that happened with how she met Kevin and Toy Matinee, which yes, check. She did say there was this band I heard about called Toy Matinee. Now how she met him was a little confusing. I'm not sure, whether she didn't really discuss like how she was introduced to him. She was in LA shopping her demo or whatever. Sort of from the time, and like especially after the time she left as one of Michael Jackson's background singers, I didn't know all the sort of controversy that happened with her and I can't even remember now because I watched it on Friday, but there was definitely some things that happened, unfortunately, with her and Michael Jackson's, some people involved with Michael Jackson, not Michael Jackson himself, but it was very kind of not out of character, but that's the right word to say. It wasn't like Sheryl Crow's real sort of who she was. It was not necessarily what she kind of intended to do, the way she dressed, even though, she probably enjoyed singing with Michael Jackson, doing it and, getting that kind of experience. But she was a teacher, too, before that, from this small town in Missouri. They also did address the... okay, so getting to the Kevin Gilbert stuff, she meets Kevin, but I thought that she had met through Patrick Leonard, because Patrick Leonard, of course, was both involved with... Was Patrick Leonard? Maybe it was Bill Bottrell. One of those two was involved with Black or White, because Kevin Gilbert engineered the actual single for Black or White. And so I was like, I guess maybe not. That was just coincidence. Maybe they had that in common when he met her or whatever, because they did date. They were a couple for a duration of time. But I always thought that was maybe how they actually ended up connecting. But of course, Bill Bottrell ended up producing the Tuesday Night Music Club. But so they talk about Tuesday Night Music Club. They show photos, some footage. They did show a clip or two of Toy Matinee too, although I didn't really show her like the Live at the Roxy or any of that footage but they just showed a clip of. They played a clip of Last Plane Out. But then it talked about the Tuesday Night Music Club, the group of people in there that Kevin introduced her to, and it wasn't that much, but it was enough where I was impressed. I actually would go back and watch it again. It's on Showtime on demand, I would guess. So, but it talked about how when Bill Bottrell, not Sheryl really, but it was really Bill Bottrell, sort of wanted to steer the ship in his own way with that debut record more than Kevin and probably some of the other members, Brian McLeod, David Burwell. Kevin especially, they specifically cited Kevin in that piece. Kevin wasn't crazy about it, and that's when he jumped ship. I swear I probably read a few accounts about that, but not that specificity. I didn't realize how much Kevin and Bill Bottrell actually butted heads. Or whatever you want to call it, butted heads. It was kind of, I've known that for quite a while, that Kevin Gilbert's sort of personality and his approach, especially at that time, I suppose a few years later, it wasn't quite the same, but his sort of interest in sort of, this is the music I'm making, I'm only going to do it if it's going to be done the way I want it to be done. I mean, when he was collaborating with Keith Emerson or something like that, I'm sure he just went with whatever Keith wanted. But in that particular case, and a lot of the bands, kind of why he ended up going back from Energy to, well, not some Energy, but Giraffe, the Giraffe stuff, and maybe even his experience with Eddie Money says, this isn't the way I want to do things. Even he played on one Eddie Money record, Giraffe, and then Toy Matinee, and it does explain Kevin's sort of personality of not being, I wouldn't call him a control freak exactly, but definitely being more comfortable if his vision for what the way he thinks the music would be best happened, and if someone else doesn't agree with him, then there's no certainty that Kevin sticks around. So that probably had something, if not a lot, to do with sort of a lot of the drama that happened with the Tuesday Night Music Club. Now, it wasn't just Kevin, but of course the story people you can read about with that group. She releases her album, and Bill Bottrell, I don't know if it was Brian McLeod, maybe the only one still left on the touring band. Of course, then the Grammy story where the rest of the guys showed up at the Grammy because they received credit. You look at the credits for the Tuesday Night Music Club. Kevin himself is like credited, I think, on 8 songs, but initially I don't believe he was. So, but it wasn't noted exactly, but it wasn't stressed because it also talked about how the author of Leaving Las Vegas. That's what I'm getting with the Letterman thing. The author of Leaving Las Vegas, now I'm forgetting his name, took his own life, like after. Well, I don't know if it was purely because of John O'Brien. After she talked to Letterman about after playing that song, and then saying Letterman put her on the spot, basically saying, was this based on your life story? Is this autobiographical? And she kind of said yes, but I'll give her credit. She wasn't like, she was kind of put on the spot, and she was kind of, not really, she wasn't like definitive saying, yes, I grew up, I spent all this time in Las Vegas, I grew up in Las Vegas, this is purely biographical. She didn't mention John O'Brien, but she mentioned how she wasn't aware of John O'Brien's book. But he took his own life not that long after. Now, of course, they mentioned that, and that was certainly noteworthy and sad to hear about. They did not talk about how Kevin passed away, how he took his own life accidentally a few years later. But that was more or less the extent of it, because then they talked about the different other sort of what she did musically, and her trials and tribulations with different relationships, as I mentioned. They didn't mention really Owen Wilson. They showed him in a clip. Of course, I've seen The Minus Man. And, I don't know if they met on the set on that or they had already been a couple at that point. It was after that. I don't know the timeline. But they didn't mention Owen Wilson. They of course, talked about Lance Armstrong and a couple other people. And then, of course, Bill Bottrell. Bill Bottrell left after her second record and that was not explained. So now, watching this thing, and I pretty much understood and assumed going into this documentary is going to be done purely in her vision and her sort of story, her version of everything, because it's hers. It's her documentary. It makes sense in a lot of ways why it's been so many years and she never addressed this. But I admit that, even though I've really come down on my sort of, I've never hated her, but sort of my sort of, say apathy or just lack of interest in her music. I still don't know how much of her music I really am going to ever have an interest in. I mean, my wife likes it, but I'll say that, she comes across much better in the documentary than I've even seen from her before. So, but again, I'm not one of those Kevin Gilbert fans that absolutely despised her. I just I've never cared for her music, but I always thought that she could promote Kevin's music. That was my own thing about her. But, I can understand why she just doesn't want to, go there, because there's been so much, apathy, or it's not apathy, but just sort of hatred and blame from so many people, including the Kevin Gilbert fans, from her. It's not just those fans, though. It's just she's been in like isolation, but she's been somewhat quiet, although she's still prolific as a musician and a songwriter. Although my wife contends that more or less about early 2000s or mid 2000s, she went country. She moved to Nashville, I think it was. It mentions that she raises her children there. She kind of jumped ship. My wife did. She's not really in. She's like, if I want to listen to country rock, I'll listen to Michael Nesmith. And actually, Michael Nesmith took made a few comments about her. Actually, weren't so favorable either. So Joyce, my wife, is sort of conflicted. This musician she likes and her favorite musician are at odds. I'm not sure. I read something between Fish and Pain of Salvation. They had a bit of a conflict once, but I don't know how much truth there actually was. So it was a third degree account. But so yeah, I mean, it was definitely worth seeing. I mean, I guess I feel more kind of respect and kind of not at peace, but just comfortable with Sheryl Crow. More than as a musician, but just as a person. Stuff's past the past. Things happened after everything with the Tuesday Night Music Club happened. Kevin and her actually worked together. They both covered the Joker as Gruno It was talked about on the You Are Here podcast. I think it was an interview. They were kind of competitive between their two albums, Thud and Tuesday Night Music Club, and when they were making them and that whole thing. But yeah, they both cover the Joker, and they both, people have made more out of it. And, I probably was given some bad impressions when I first was introduced to Kevin Gilbert, the whole story with Sheryl Crow. But yeah, I mean, I take it with a grain of salt. I take the documentary with a grain. An actual reporter, a neutral observer. I never seen this behind the music, but the neutral observer probably would be kind of diving into some of the other controversial topics. But I don't think Sheryl would be willing to be interviewed for some of that. And some of these people were not interviewed, including Owen Wilson or some of the members of the Tuesday Night Music Club. They weren't interviewed in it, so that's what happened. This is her documentary, and for as a whole, it was a pretty good documentary. Not a great documentary, but it was a good enough documentary. I take it with a grain of salt, but I did enjoy seeing it. So if you've seen the Sheryl documentary, what's your take? I mean, if you're a Kevin fan, some of the Kevin Gilbert fans on Facebook said they didn't even want to bother with it, but you can't at least give her some credit for at least bringing up and telling a sliver of the story, which I look at it one way is there's going to be a lot of people that end up seeing this thing that have never heard of Kevin's name or never heard of Toy Matinee. They might actually, check out some of his music. So she kind of is indirectly doing what I've wanted her to do for ages, to say he's passed away, he's gone, but he was a genius musician. And she mentioned that. He was a brilliant musician. His music could be heard by more people and should be. So kind of like Jeff Buckley, but... So anyway, but thank you for watching. Again, what's your take on the Sheryl Crow documentary? What's your take on Sheryl's music? Myself, I mean, I'm not a fan of her voice that much. I don't hate it. I just don't like it. But I'll admit that there's probably some songs that I probably could like more than others. The real holy grail, as I mentioned before, is by some chance both her she's comfortable with and A&M Records, whether they're owned by Interscope or whoever is now. Feels it worth releasing some kind of extended version of the Tuesday Night Music Club album with alternate takes. There was the deluxe edition, but that didn't have. With alternate takes, demos, we'd get some stuff, including possibly some stuff with Kevin on vocals. Of course, he plays the bass line, All I Want to Do, and he plays on so many other songs, but that's the holy grail for Kevin fans, for other people. I'm sure their Sheryl Crow fans would love to hear that too. That might happen someday. I don't know if after that deluxe edition came out a few years ago, whether they were the legacy edition, I don't know whether they're going to release another version. But I hope someday maybe that were to happen. Even if just put them up on Spotify. That would be probably the final piece of the Kevin Gilbert puzzle at this point, because the estate's released so much stuff, but that's not going to be released by the state, and that's going to be a matter of literally, her or her estate and or the record label being willing to do that. So, but anyway, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.